Earlier this week, I was with part of my family at Sde Boker, a kibbutz in the Negev, which is made famous because of its most famous resident, David Ben-Gurion, the first prime minister of Israel, who retired to the kibbutz in the Negev after serving as prime minister. There he was treated like everyone else. When it was his turn to serve meals or clean up dishes, that's what he did. Now the Negev is a desert, and if you've ever been in a desert, you know by its very nature, it's dry. In fact, that's the meaning of the word Negev. And that other than a few cactus trees randomly scattered around, it is seemingly devoid of any kind of life. But when my grandchildren, my daughter Margalit, my wife Simcha, and I went on a night safari in a Jeep earlier this week, after it was dark, armed with flashlights, it was amazing to see how alive and how teeming with activity the desert actually is. We saw plants and insects that glow when exposed to ultraviolet light, botanical phenomena which in regular daylight we're not able to see. We witnessed the active life of nocturnal animals, many of which are dormant during the day. And much of what we saw is not seen in the regular light of the day due to either camouflage or because the animals would wait until dark when it's cooler to come out. Each organism has its own unique defense mechanism to protect itself and its species from prey, leading me to marvel at the creativity of our Creator, HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Now, when we got out of the Jeep and we walked around, our capable guide, a student at Midreshet Ben Gurion, the largest institute in the world devoted to study of the desert, he pointed out and cautioned us which creatures or plants we should be careful not to touch because they were poisonous or venomous or dangerous. And so I wanted to be sure we would avoid and be careful not to approach them. Now, this particular warning prompted my 7-year-old granddaughter, Alexa, who earlier had been told when we were in the Tel Aviv Natural Museum of History not to touch the exhibits. She astutely observed and said, "You know, Saba, if you touch something in a museum, you get in trouble. But if you touch something out here in the desert, you could actually die." So she got the message. One lesson I took away from our desert adventure, where I saw so much activity, is that things are not always what they appear to be. Things are not what they appear to be. What may present as inactive or non-active or appear to be harmless is not always the reality. And I think this is an important lesson in life itself, and I think it's one of the points we learned from this week's Torah reading as well. To really know what is going on, to really understand and to comprehend something, you have to look closely beneath the surface. And that's part of my message to our young people today as well. The Torah portion, Tazria Mitzora, describes the elaborate procedures and what to do when a skin abrasion surfaces or a skin disease breaks out. Now, as we've heard from our B'nai Mitzvah who've taught us this morning and from Rabbi Weinblatt, our sages interpreted the phenomena as being basically a physical manifestation of a deeper inner spiritual ailment. And so they were required to quarantine and isolate from society. It was necessitated for a period of time, not just for health reasons, and not just to protect the rest of the community, but to allow for a period of self-reflection, to allow the individual the opportunity to look deeply into one's soul so that that person can assess their actions and what perhaps needed to be changed. Part of the process of being restored to a state of purity entails subsequently having the Kohen, the priest, inspect the affected individual. He must look very closely beneath the surface, again, to be sure that the lesion or whatever is broken out on the skin has fully disappeared before the person is allowed to re-enter the community. And so, this desert experience, combined with this week's Torah reading, remind me the importance of close examination, of going always beneath the surface. And I take this to mean to more fully comprehend a situation. In order to understand a person, a predicament, look deeper than what you initially see. In other words, to be even more precise and even more direct as to how this applies to life today, to truly understand what is happening. On a personal level, seek to fully understand what is happening in your friend's life if you really want to be there for them. And there's a more global application of this message as well. To assess our world, to form opinions, look beyond the headlines. Do not rely on superficial reports. Do not just accept platitudes or simplistic slogans or labels bantered about and which are so easily and readily applied and hurled by opposing sides at each other. I offer this as a cautionary note in the context of understanding what's going on in Israel today as well. By way of example, you may have heard about the so-called storming of the Al-Aqsa Mosque by Israeli police last week or the week before. What you probably did not hear about is the violation of the prohibition against staying there overnight, or the arsenal that had been accumulated and was being stored there in order to be hurled at Jewish worshippers below who would be there at the Kotel the following day. Nor would I venture to say, did you hear about the 150,000 Muslims who prayed peacefully each and every day of Ramadan on the Temple Mount? And that altogether, there were several million, about 4 million, who prayed there during the holiday. So as we see and we read and we hear about the rallies going on in the streets of Tel Aviv, opposing judicial reforms and other measures proposed by the governing coalition, it's important to look beyond the surface if one wants to really understand the reasons for both the protest as well as the proposed reforms. And that's why in a few weeks, I invite you to come to the discussion that Ido and I will lead in the chapel after services about what is going on in Israel today, as we'll take a deep dive and go beyond the headlines on May 13. Now, while I was in Israel, several events occurred that reminded everyone of how much there is, despite all of the divisions, all of the contentiousness, all of the controversy and the divisiveness surrounding current events, how much there is that still unites them. Prodded by Iran, Hezbollah launched rockets in the north, while Hamas in the south joined in, and there were several vicious terrorist attacks, reminding everyone that Israel's enemies did not stop to ask about or make a distinction based on the political affiliation of their targets. They were simply viewed as Jews and as Israelis. One incident was especially notable for its shocking brutality and the response to it. 15-year-old Rina D. and her 20-year-old sister Maya, as well as their mother Lucy, were shot and killed in their vehicle on a highway for no reason by Palestinian terrorists on their way to a family hike. The entire city of Efrat, where they lived, said psalms and prayers while they clung to life. Tens of thousands of people from across the whole country came to their funeral. And the father, the husband, who now had lost his two daughters and his wife, Rabbi Leo D., who had made Aliyah from England with his family a number of years ago, said that while he wants the killer brought to justice, he holds no hatred or malice towards Palestinians, nor even to the terrorists who killed his family. He was comforted by Israeli Arabs and even Palestinians who came to offer condolences. In the aftermath of the tragedy, he called upon the Israeli public to observe what he called D-Day, his last name, D, as a time to differentiate between good and evil, to understand the difference between right and wrong, and for it to be a day of solidarity and Jewish unity. The community of Efrat, where they live, has established 3 communal projects: Arona D Youth Center, Maya D's Spring and Park, and the Lucy D Simcha Hall, in order to turn this senseless tragedy of the deaths of these beautiful 3 people into a celebration and perpetuation of the values that they lived and that they exemplified in their lives. Now, the final day of the 7-day Shiva was punctuated by the siren sounded on Yom HaShoah v'HaGvura, Holocaust Memorial Day, a day which is uniquely observed in Israel when the entire country comes to a total standstill to mourn the loss of 1/3 of our people. It's something you have to actually be there and witness to understand how powerful it is. I was in the airport when it happened, when the siren went off at 10 a.m. 5 minutes before, I was trying to get something from the eatery. They'd cut it off and said no, they weren't taking any orders for that period of time, so that everyone would be able to observe the moment of silence. And sure enough, everything came to a standstill. Now, Rabbi D had recently seen a plaque in a cemetery in Tzfat for Leopold, the uncle for whom he was named and who had been murdered by the Nazis. It was next to the gravesite of his great-grandmother. He commented that his uncle, like so many others who had no grave, who was anonymously murdered by the Nazis, was a contrast with what he experienced in Israel, where he was comforted by the entire Jewish community, by the entire nation coming together, as well as by Christians and Muslims and even Palestinian neighbors. He said, quote, "There's something about living in the land of Israel as a Jew, which means you're no longer anonymous. You're no longer unimportant. You affect your community, you affect the country, you affect the world, and your story is global." And so he urged the people to realize that the call never again is the responsibility of all to be sure that such tragedies never happen again. It's everyone's responsibility. And Rabbi D reminded all Israelis of what is at stake when he spoke at the funeral for his daughters. And listen to what he said. He said at the funeral, quote, "Today the Jewish people have proven that we are one. When a family in Efrat hurts, we're all hurt. There's no clearer proof of our unity. We have been marching through the streets of Jerusalem and Tel Aviv with Israeli flags, and we've been arguing over whether there should be a majority of 61 or 65 or 70, an override clause or no override clause in the Supreme Court, and other issues. But let's be honest, most of us have no idea what any of this means." And so then he turned to everyone and he said, "On Yom HaZikaron and Yom HaAtzmaut, Israel's Memorial Day and Israel's Independence Day to be celebrated next week, we will once again march, and we will march side by side. We will all carry Israeli flags, left wing next to right wing, religious along with secular, and we will unite against the real threat, the threat of pure evil, the threat of a mad, ideologically driven terrorism funded by Iran, Hamas, and Hezbollah, who don't care if you're from Efrat or from Tel Aviv or London or Italy or maybe even Potomac or Bethesda." And then he said, I added those last words, and then he said, "We will all march as one." And so on these days, when we stand between Yom HaShoah and Yom HaZikaron and Yom HaAtzmaut, let us remember the importance of standing as one, and let us say Amen.